Well, howdy, neighbor. Today's video is gonna be a little difficult to record because it's about something that doesn't exist. Mind you, that's not stopped me before. We're going to be covering a theoretical idea today, rather than something that's actually within the game. Indeed, today's topic is about something that, if I had a hand in Warframe's development, I would push to have implemented. Now, normally, I don't like pushing ideas out to the community if I feel said idea might not end up sitting right with me a few weeks later, because by that point, it would already be too late and my pea-brain would already be on display for the world to see. I've, made this mistake in the past. Remember how I said in my Wisp video, you don't really build a Wisp for power strength? Ooh, that opinion didn't age well. But with this particular idea, I have had plenty of time to sit on it and bring it up from just being a concept to a fully designed blueprint. Because I've had this idea in my mind for roughly, I want to say roughly a year now? Yeah, I probably could have gotten to this sooner. But okay, on with it. What exactly is the topic for today? Put plainly, we're gonna be conjuring up a theoretical game mode, which might throw some of you for a bit of a loop, because Warframe as a game has been injected with so many fucking mission types that Mario Party is looking about as depthful as one of these! Because who can forget everyone's favorite game mode? Infested Salvage! So where in the hell do I get off adding to this list? Well, I want you to humor me for a moment and imagine something. What if I told you that I could come up with an in-game game mode that was challenging, but offered that challenge without scaling enemies up to level 2 billion? A mode that relies far less on gear checks for difficulty, yet provides that challenge while still taking a player's earned strengths into account. A mode that would also give veterans a reason to briefly return to weaker and often forgotten weaponry. And, to top it all off, what if I told you that it would have the potential to always be challenging? Because that is what I'm going to be trying to convince you of today. This is the Tower Heist mode. But before we get further into it, let's first dive into the mess of problems that Warframe has found itself juggling worse than this animation. Because it's kind of important to make clear the things that this in-game mode will try to avoid that the rest of the game is plagued with. This mode's primary focus is providing an in-game challenge while also avoiding two main issues. Difficulty that mostly relies on the raising of enemy stats, not allowing players to use the tools they've earned and crafted throughout their time playing the game, and as a little treat, this mode's entire challenge will not be lost just because a player gets better gear, and will also offer players the chance to use forgotten weaponry in a viable setting. But at any rate, these are our two main issues to deal with. So before we get into what the mode would be like, let's first dive deeper into these key issues. Starting with Warframe's always had a hazy history with difficulty, hasn't it? This is a game where 1 second you could be mowing through a room after pressing a single button, and the next you're rounding a corner and getting instantly obliterated by daft spunk here. Though, to give DE credit, shield gating is a thing now, which is why I can't show you getting my ass blown open like a Rafflesia by a corrupt shotgunner anymore. And with the alterations to how stats function and general scaling changes, they do seem to be on the right track here. So yeah, kudos, D. But with that said, there's still much to be desired. Mainly because stat adjustments can only do so much. After all, Warframe is inherently designed around players unga-bunga smashing enemies into a red paste. I always found it interesting how DE marketed Warframe's original concept as Left 4 Dead in space. Because, while sure, they're both four-person horde shooters, let me tell you, Warframe doesn't come close to being able to put on the kind of pressure that this does! In Warframe, if I were to tell you to go complete a node, any node, by yourself, you would probably have it done in like 5 minutes without breaking a sweat. And the reason for that is that Warframe is a power fantasy game, like Prototype, but with more luscious man-ass. But with Left 4 Dead, well, to make my point hit home, let's do an experiment. Reinstall the game right now. Okay, now let's start a campaign on, say, this difficulty. Okay, now that I have you here, I want you to do something that I said you could do easy peasy in Warframe. Complete a section of Left 4 Dead by yourself. Remove the AI. I guarantee, short of being a veteran speedrunner, you will not have a good time. Warframe, on the other hand, branched off to become a power fantasy style shooter where you can smash a dent into your forehead and still come away victorious. Now, to clarify, Warframe choosing the path that it did wasn't a bad thing. In fact, it doesn't need this kind of difficulty. But its lack of its own defined challenge has come back to haunt it in recent years. And thus, we've had situations in which DE has tried to add difficulty into the game with often mixed results. Things like sorties and floods get most of their difficulty mainly by scaling enemy stats out the ass. But that's not the kind of difficulty that I'm personally looking for in in-game. This isn't a freaking click and hotkey cycle MMO. This is a shooter. Is there really no other way to offer a challenge? Well, the truth is, it is a hard problem to solve. Hell, even the player base seems to understand that it's quite the conundrum. You know you have a problem on your hands when even the incredible Redditors with their 800 IQ can't quite agree on how to fix it. Because how the shit do you balance a game that has these abominations without relying on stat boosting? But DE has gotten close, only to make a mistake and crush the community perception of the idea into the ground. For an example, as much of a meme as it was, Dog Days, of all things, actually had a pretty decent challenge to it. When you weren't fucking idling it! It's drastically reduced variables, in both the numerical sense and the options sense. Players were given a set amount of health. No one had any shields, no one had any abilities, and everyone had the same gun. And honestly, if you just let the Grenier gang up on you like they were sponsoring Brazzers, that was a really, really good way to get yourself killed. Also, shoutouts to Faceless Beanie for a lot of this event footage, because I was way too much of a brainlet to get any recordings for archive purposes. Whoops. Now, here's the kicker. They weren't like level 100 or anything. In fact, they were only around level 40 if I recall correctly. For once, a trash unit was actually threatening when in a group. It almost feels like the entire event was an experiment to see if DE could achieve some semblance of difficulty without having to be like... They even had one enemy who was much harder to kill than the rest, Garish. And they accomplished this not by giving him increased health, not by increasing his armor, not by increasing his damage, or giving him damage reduction. He was just fast. Like, look at this graph. That's right. With a single graph, DE has proven that the Warframe community is really bad at handling scouts. Granted, a large part of that was down to players being restricted to a piss shooter, and that is where Dog Day's own problem lies. It took away the entire point of the game. You had no customization. You know, all of this shit! So while, yeah, it provided difficulty without stat boosting, it also just wasn't Warframe anymore. Between that and the repetition of the event, I feel this all caused opinions on the event to, unfortunately, be mixed. And speaking of that problem, they also ran into the same issue again very recently with the Gribble Missions, which leads us into... This hasn't happened very often, but between Dog Days and this questline, it has been more prevalent. DE has, on occasion, attempted to provide difficulty by just taking away a player's power. Be it their mods, their entire arsenal, or their gear items.
I have disabled your gear items.
And to be perfectly honest with you, that is a good idea to offer difficulty, but the problem is that they didn't do it with much flair or charm. And what I mean by that is, they don't offer a fun reason to why your strengths are taken away. Case in point, Gribble Missions. If you weren't aware, in order to acquire Gribble, you need to do 3 missions to get each of his 3 parts. But the kicker is that you're not allowed any mods on your equipment. It was an interesting concept, and I'll give them this. The Gribble Missions were the first set of missions in years that had me come up with a specific strategy to get through. And that was a really cool breath of fresh air. And unlike Dog Days, it did keep some of a player's choices in mind while still offering a decent challenge. You can now pick your frame, use its abilities, and choose your weapons. However, it still fell for the crucial problem. It didn't respect the customization part of the game. Now, be honest with me. Would you even be playing this game if you couldn't mod and kit out your stuff? I'm willing to bet that a big chunk of you would say no. So, while I did enjoy having to rub my 2 brain cells together for once, I still left the Gribble Missions feeling a little bit off. So, with all of that out of the way, we have 2 problems that need solving. How do we provide difficulty without just scaling enemies? And if we do limit a player's options, how do we do it in a way that's fun, that also respects the fact that players put time into the gear they've acquired? So, keep those 2 things in mind as we finally dive into the overview for Tower Heist. Tower Heist takes a number of roguelike elements and mixes them into Warframe's large pool of mods and weapons. It has players running through a multi-floored Orokin tower, trying to get as far as they can. Players proceed through a floor by completing a miniature version of a mission type, such as a defense with only 2 enemy waves, or an interception with only 1 or 2 capture points. Every time the player completes an objective, they will go up another floor and be given a new objective. After every few floors is a boss floor, which is then followed by a checkpoint floor. Lastly, players cannot be revived if they fall, outside of a few exceptions. But here is the main feature of the Tower Heist. Players start the heist with no mods or arcanes, and a limited selection of weaponry. The use of Operator would also be limited in some way as well. However, players can find their mods and weaponry within the tower by either killing high-rank enemies or finding caches. Once a checkpoint floor is reached, players are given a small time limit to equip whatever they found and continue through the tower. The gear a player is able to find in the tower comes directly from what they've acquired throughout the rest of the game. For an example, if you put your heart and soul into a Za or a Kuva weapon, you and only you will be able to find it as a reward within the tower. This also applies to ribbons, arcanes, and primed mods. In other words, the strengths that you've acquired outside of the tower make a significant impact on your performance within it. For the sake of convenience, the tower will not take duplicates into account when dropping gear for players, and will only choose the highest ranking version of an item to drop. Variants, such as primed mods and weapons, are counted as different equipment with a higher rarity, however. Players will be given a choice to pick one of 3 randomly chosen frames to enter the tower with. The reason for this is to prevent a meta from springing up and just choosing whatever frame is the most likely to get through the early portions of the tower. So, no, you can't just keep taking a Naros! Mods, arcanes, and weapons will be split into tiers of rarity, and the higher you proceed through the tower, the better the odds of finding higher tiered gear. But again, you must have owned this equipment and gotten it to level 30 for any of it to appear as loot. For example, at super low levels, the most common gear drops would be things like the Boltor, the Lex, or the Jewel Skana, as well as more common mods like Vitality or Sprint. But at higher floors, you have a better chance of finding things like the Tiburon Prime, the Opticore, or the Grand Prime, as well as rarer staple mods such as Prime Continuity or Adaptation. Something worth noting is that even if you've discarded a weapon from your arsenal, it will still appear in the tower for use, assuming that you got the weapon to level 30 prior to trashing it. This is done to introduce forgotten weaponry into the drop pools and to also prevent exploiting. But you will always be able to find high tier gear regardless of the floor that you're on. Lastly, regarding mod drops, for the sake of our sanity, most mods deemed worthless by the community will not be within the tables for the tower. So things like warm coats will not be clogging the tables. See, at first, I pondered how fucking hilarious it would be to have someone with terrible luck going through the tower and finding something like 5 installations in a row, but then I realized the same effect could be had by the player finding any of the same mod 8,000 times. So, that's the basic overview of the mode. Lastly, let's go into some of the whys and hows of how certain choices came to be. So, first off, here's a valid question. Is having roguelike elements in a game as well, for lack of a better term, brain dead as Warframe, a good idea. After all, not everyone has enough good taste to enjoy the incredible experience of something like Noita. I don't want to isolate a huge chunk of people here. So how are we avoiding that? Well, there's an incredibly important key point here that should be taken into account. This would not be a mode with inevitable failure. When people think of the term roguelike, they probably imagine their first runs always ending in death, but coming back the next run with a small permanent boost of some kind. And I love that shit, personally. But for a title like Warframe, with such a huge casual player base, that probably isn't a great idea, if the reception to this is anything to go by. Just because I would enjoy dying over and over again, does not mean that the rest of the 26 million registered losers would. So no, when I said I was going to incorporate roguelike elements, I was specifically referring to starting weak and growing strong, as well as looting gear. But the whole progression by death element is being left on the table. Ideally, failures in Tower Heist should be uncommon. Not so common that it frustrates the player base, but enough that players mentally register failure as a legitimate threat rather than a once-in-a-blue-moon event. The goal of Tower Heist isn't to kill you regardless of how well you play, it's to make you think before you act in order to make progression easier. Like in most areas of this game, I can spam Radial Disarm and force Corpus to try to kill me with VR cock wands. The idea in Tower Heist, however, is that because I wouldn't immediately have my godlike range and efficiency to do this whenever I wanted, I would have to think carefully when deciding to spend that 100 energy. Until the game gives me this. There's also another reason why I chose this formula. Warframe is just asking for it. With all the different weapons, mods, and arcanes, it's pretty much making itself ripe for this kind of mode. Picture this. You stumble into a room, and you are just desperate for a damage mod. But then, you see it. Do you risk taking it? Is it really worth it for the possibility of shooting at a Nox only to hit a wall and—
Hatrade's coming!
And the answer is yes, you're not a fucking pansy. Also, I just feel like it'd be a cool idea for an MMO shooter to have. Most roguelikes have an ending that you strive for, but typically, once you achieve that ending, there's not often much reason to play through the game again. And yet, just because you've beaten it, doesn't mean you've beaten it. You could start a new game, cocky with your achievement, confident that you've mastered it and could breeze through it again with elegance and grace, only to get your nuts shoved down your urethra. And that is kind of beautiful. But Warframe has no ending. This means that just because you successfully got what you needed from the tower, doesn't mean that's the last time you will ever experience it. One of the things that often happens in Warframe is growing out of your weapons, and this will be more noticeable to those who are not currently at endgame. As someone who was playing back during the Stone Age, I vividly remember when weapons like the Boltor or the Acid were meta, but unfortunately, over time, they slowly fell by the wayside. And while things like variants and Rivens try to alleviate this, they're not always going to be available to you, and there's still many weapons with stats like this. And see, it's not that the weapons got worse. At least, in most cases. No, it's that the standards for performance rose. And some weapons are just inherently designed to only be used in early game, then swapped out later on. But what if you liked using that Flux Rifle or the Despair? Tower Heist plans to change that. During the early floors where lower tier weapons are more common, you'll be given opportunities to use them in areas where they can, actually function. Instead of it feeling like— Of course, as you find better weapons, you will still swap them out, but remember, every run would start you out with just the basics. So even when acquiring something as simple as an unprimed Boltor, it would still be getting its time to shine. And that is the gist of Tower Heist. Starting with little, but gaining strength each floor. Veterans would be able to get a taste of what it's like to not always have their primed riven gear, yet would still be rewarded for acquiring said gear. Newbies would be encouraged to find new mods and craft new tools for use within the tower. Old weapons would get their time in the spotlight. Actual strategies would bloom between squads in order to breeze past early floors, and I still wouldn't be able to beat Noita. The perfect outcome for everyone. Hey, if you stuck with me until the end of the video, I just wanted to say thanks. I know I was incredibly slow to getting another piece of content out, and I put out an explanation video going over why a number of days ago. It's unlisted, it can be found within the community page, but I still wanted to apologize at any rate. Anyways, I'm putting some 75 platinum codes on screen right now. I really wish I could provide more. I'd give you all one if I could. But regardless, cheers again guys, and thanks for watching.